14. Now, the Tasmanian government is set to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 years of age, with no exceptions by the year 2029. The change comes under the state's new Youth Justice Blueprint, issued in response to recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. Campaigners have been pushing for the criminal age of responsibility to be raised across Australia, and they say this one in Tasmania is a landmark win. And now Change the Record is a First Nations-led justice coalition campaigning to end the mass incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Their national director is Maggie Munn. They're a Gungari campaigner and join us now. Maggie, good morning. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me, Tom.
How significant is this in Tassie? What sort of an impact do you think this is expected to make?
Yeah, it's a huge call from the Tasmanian government, and we're really pleased to see that come in this week, to raise the age to 14 from 10 makes Tasmania the first Australian jurisdiction to make that jump without a tailored approach. So we've seen in the ACT, for example, they passed legislation earlier this year where they're going to raise the age to 12 first and then to 14 in the future. But Tasmania has taken on the advice of advocates, experts, community, and organisations like ours, and they're raising it from 10 to 14 by 2029. So it's a huge step, and we're really glad to see it.
Yeah, because when I first read that, I thought, hang on, isn't the ACT going down this direction as well? But there are exceptions there with its legislation, right? It's not a blanket thing in the ACT.
That's correct, yeah. So when we talk about exceptions, in this particular case, we're talking about carve-out offences. So the ACT is taking a two-step process, I guess. So they're raising it first to 12 and then to 14, but they also have carve-out offences, what they call, serious offences. And so that means that the age of criminal responsibility will stay at a lower age for those serious offences.
For more serious crimes, right? Yeah, I knew that there were exceptions there with the ACT, but in Tasmania, it's a blanket approach, is it? There are no exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, that's certainly the commitment that we've seen in the Youth Justice Blueprint. The next step is for legislation to be drafted, or a bill to be drafted, and we're hopeful that the Tasmanian government will maintain no exceptions as they've committed to.
Maggie, the Tasmanian government's also committed to another thing, and that's raising the minimum age of detention to 16 by 2029. I mean, we've been covering so much that Indigenous Australians are disproportionately represented in the youth justice system. But that change, 16 in a number of years' time, do you feel as though that goes far enough to address that issue?
Look, I think, the call for the minimum age of detention to be lifted to 16 is in line with what all of the Aboriginal legal services around the country have been asking for a long, long time. So I think it's promising that the Tasmanian government has heard that, and they're making these steps. I mean, ideally, we'd love to see, no child in prison, and that their behaviour that's getting them into contact with the legal system is addressed outside of prisons and detention and watch houses. But I think, this is a really huge step, and it will make a really big impact on these kids' lives, particularly, as you pointed out, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids' lives. It is frustrating that they've set themselves till 2029, which is 6 years from now, to make this happen. But I think if that means that the Tasmanian government can work with community and service providers to make sure that there's appropriate infrastructure in place to divert kids away from the legal system, support them, their families, their communities, then I think that that's a good step.
We've canvassed Tassie and the ACT, Maggie, but how do the other states and territories compare? I mean, obviously there must be mounting pressures on their leaders to raise the age.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we, Change the Record is one of the leaders of the national Raise the Age campaign, and we've been putting pressure on the different jurisdictions for a coming up to 6 years, I think, to make this change. And the Northern Territory also has legislation in place for a raised age of criminal responsibility. However, theirs is only to 12. The ACT and the Northern Territory are the only jurisdictions that have legislation in place. Tasmania will be the next one, we hope.
Yeah.
And hopefully that then sends a message to all of the other attorneys general and other jurisdictions to really sharpen their game up and listen to the experts and the advocates and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who have been calling for this for a really long time.
Because the global average is 14, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So the United Nations and the international sort of human rights standard points at 14 as the bare minimum for neurotypical able-bodied kids. But we know that there are a lot of complex trauma, disabilities, mental illnesses and conditions that a lot of kids who are young and are coming into contact with the legal system are experiencing. So we've got to bear that in mind when we're talking about this, that minimum standard just points to neurotypical able-bodied kids.
Yeah.
So we want it to be, any legislation that comes forward must be really considered and balanced with respect to the experiences of First Nations kids with disability, and neurodiverse kids as well. So it really needs to be something that governments introduce to be in line with those international minimum standards, but we're seeing a lot of resistance to that.
Okay, Maggie, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Maggie Munn there, National Director of Change the Records. Thomas Ariti with you.